In the hierarchy of wolves, some are born to rule, some to serve, and some to be forgotten entirely. Era Wolfsbane belonged to the latter, a girl whose very name had become a curse whispered in the shadows of a world that had already decided she was worth nothing. She arrived at the Ironhowl Fortress on a morning when autumn bled into winter, carrying only the clothes on her back and the kind of silence that comes from learning too young that words can be weapons turned against you. The gray servant's dress hung loose on her thin frame, borrowed from a charity that had run out of pity, and her worn shoes made no sound on the stone floors that had witnessed the rise and fall of kingdoms. To the nobles who ruled these halls, Era was invisible, another faceless servant to be overlooked, another pair of hands to scrub floors and tend fires without thought or acknowledgement. In a court where bloodlines determined destiny and strength was the only currency that mattered, she was less than nothing. She was expendable. But invisibility, Era had learned, could be its own form of armor. In the spaces between notice and neglect, she had learned to watch, to listen, to understand the intricate dance of power that played out above her station. She had seen how quickly favor could turn to fury, how swiftly the protected could become the prey. What she had not expected was to catch the attention of the one wolf in the fortress, whose notice could either elevate or destroy her. Alpha King Thane Ironhowl, whose very presence commanded the submission of lesser wolves, whose golden eyes seemed to see through the carefully constructed masks that everyone wore in his court. For in the quiet girl who moved through his halls like a ghost, Thane would recognize something that others missed, the particular stillness that comes from surviving what should have broken you, the careful way she held herself that spoke of dignity preserved against impossible odds, and the spark of defiance that burned behind downcast eyes, a flame that refused to be extinguished no matter how the world tried to snuff it out. Neither of them knew that this recognition would be the first crack in foundations built on centuries of tradition, the beginning of something that would challenge not just their own carefully guarded hearts, but the very nature of power itself. This is the story of how love finds us not in moments of triumph, but in the quiet spaces where survival meets grace. How a forgotten girl would become the most important thing in the world to a king who had believed himself beyond such vulnerabilities, and how sometimes the most profound revolutions begin not with grand declarations, but with the simple act of seeing someone the world has chosen. Oh, ignore. In the end, they would learn that the heart recognizes no hierarchy, acknowledges no bloodlines, and bows to no crown. It simply knows what it knows, and loves what it loves, consequences be damned. Before we begin, remember to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Every day, a new story awaits you. Now, let us begin. The iron gates of Ironhowl Fortress loomed against the pewter sky like the jaws of some ancient beast, their black metal twisted into patterns that seemed to shift and writhe in the morning mist. Era Wolfsbane stood before them with her meager possessions clutched in a cloth bundle, her stomach hollow with hunger and her heart empty of hope. The dress she wore, coarse gray wool that had seen better decades, hung on her thin frame like a shroud, marking her as clearly as any brand could have. Servant, expendable, nothing. The woman who had brought her this far, Matron Greaves from the Valley Orphanage, shifted impatiently beside her, eager to complete this final transaction and wash her hands of the girl who had been more burden than blessing for the past 5 years. "Remember what I told you," Greaves muttered, her voice sharp with the kind of authority that came from years of managing unwanted children. "Keep your head down, do your work, and speak only when spoken to. The Ironhowl Pact doesn't tolerate impertinence from servants, especially not from ones with your background." Era said nothing, having learned long ago that words were luxuries she couldn't afford. Instead, she nodded once and fixed her gaze on the cobblestones beneath her feet, studying the way the morning frost had gathered in the spaces between the stones. It was safer to look down, safer to remain invisible in a world that had already decided she was worth less than nothing. The massive gates swung open with a groan of protesting metal, operated by guards whose bulk seemed to dwarf even the imposing architecture. They wore the deep blue and silver of House Ironhowl, their uniforms pristine despite the early hour. When their eyes swept over Era, she felt the weight of their disdain like a physical blow. "Another charity case?" one guard asked Matron Greaves, his tone suggesting he'd rather be discussing the disposal of refuse. "Kitchen work and cleaning," Greaves replied briskly, already backing away from the entrance as if afraid she might be forced to take Era back. She's been trained properly. Won't cause any trouble. The guard's laugh was harsh and brief. They never do. Follow me, girl. Try to keep up. Ira clutched her bundle tighter and followed the guard through the gates and into a world that seemed designed to remind her of her insignificance. The fortress was a marvel of architecture and intimidation, its towers stretching toward the sky like reaching fingers, its walls thick enough to withstand siege warfare. Everything about it spoke of power consolidated over centuries, of a pack that had never known defeat. The courtyard they crossed was larger than the entire orphanage where Ira had spent her adolescence, filled with training equipment and warriors who moved with the fluid grace of born predators. Even in human form, their wolf nature was evident in the way they carried themselves, alert, dangerous, and absolutely certain of their place in the hierarchy. A few glanced in her direction as she passed, their expressions ranging from indifferent to mildly curious. She was clearly a new servant, which meant she was worth exactly as much attention as the stone beneath their feet, none at all. "Kitchen entrance is this way," the guard said without looking back, leading her around the side of the main building to a smaller door that was clearly meant for the help. "Cook's name is Bertha. Do what she tells you when she tells you, and you might last longer than the last 3 girls they sent up from the valley." Ira wanted to ask what had happened to the last 3 girls, but the guard had already abandoned her at the kitchen door, striding away as if her very presence might contaminate his uniform. She stood alone for a moment, gathering what little courage she possessed, then knocked softly. The door was yanked open by a woman who could have been carved from the same stone as the fortress itself. Bertha was massive in the way of women who had spent decades feeding others while forgetting to care for themselves. Her gray hair pinned back in a severe bun, and her apron stained with evidence of morning meal preparation. "You the new girl?" Bertha's voice was gruff but not unkind, her small eyes taking in Ira's appearance with the practiced assessment of someone who had learned to judge people quickly. "Skinny little thing, aren't you? Well, no matter. We'll put some meat on those bones if you last long enough." She stepped aside to let Ira enter, and the warmth of the kitchen hit her like a blessing after the cold morning air. The space was enormous, with multiple hearths crackling with fires, and long wooden tables scarred from years of use. The scent of baking bread and roasted meat made Ira's mouth water despite her nervousness. "Name?" Bertha asked, already turning back to a pot that demanded stirring. "Ira Wolfsbane, ma'am." Bertha's hand stilled on the wooden spoon. When she turned back to face Ira, her expression had shifted from mild curiosity to something approaching shock. "Wolfsbane," she repeated slowly. "As in the Wolfsbane pack from the northern borders?" Ira's throat tightened. She had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that her family name might have been forgotten after all these years, that the scandal and disgrace might have faded into memory. But Bertha's reaction told her that some stains never washed clean. "Yes, ma'am," Ira whispered. Bertha studied her with new intensity, taking in the delicate bone structure that had once been called aristocratic, the unusual violet eyes that marked her as carrying bloodlines too dangerous to acknowledge, the way she held herself with unconscious grace despite her obvious poverty. "Well," Bertha said finally, her tone carefully neutral, "that explains a few things. Don't suppose you remember much about pack protocol from before. Everything. Before the massacre. Before her parents' execution for treason. Before 5-year-old Ira had been stripped of title, family, and future in a single night of blood and political necessity. Some," Ira admitted. "But I understand my place now, ma'am. I'm here to work. Nothing more." Bertha nodded slowly, but her eyes remained watchful. "See that you remember that, child. The past is past, and dwelling on it won't keep you alive in this place. You're a servant now, same as any other. The name you carry don't matter to the wolves in this fortress. They care about what you can do for them, not what your bloodline used to be." It was a kindness, that warning, though it came wrapped in harsh truth. Ira nodded her understanding and allowed herself to be led through the kitchen, where Bertha introduced her to the other servants with brisk efficiency. There was Mary, a middle-aged woman with flour permanently embedded under her fingernails, who managed the bread ovens. Young Tom, barely past adolescence, who kept the fires fed and the heavy pots cleaned. Sarah and Anne, sisters who handled most of the serving duties for the main dining hall. And finally, old Henrik, whose bent back and gnarled hands told the story of 40 years spent in service to the Iron Howl pack. They all seemed pleasant enough, though Ira caught the way conversations paused when she approached. the careful way they avoided asking about her background. In a fortress built on hierarchy and reputation, a servant with a notorious surname was both curiosity and liability. "You'll start with basic cleaning," Bertha announced, handing Era a bucket and a collection of rags that had seen better years. "Upper floors first. Guest chambers and common areas. Keep quiet. Keep invisible. And for the love of the moon, don't touch anything that looks expensive." Era nodded and accepted the cleaning supplies, grateful to have work that would keep her moving. Movement meant less time to think, less opportunity for the memories to surface and drag her back into the darkness she'd fought so hard to escape. The upper floors of the fortress were even more impressive than the kitchen, all polished wood and rich tapestries that spoke of wealth accumulated over generations. The guest chambers were luxurious beyond anything Era had experienced even in her early childhood, with carved furniture and windows that offered sweeping views of the territory beyond the fortress walls. She worked methodically, the way she'd been taught at the orphanage, paying careful attention to corners and details that other servants might miss. It was peaceful work, meditative in its repetition, and for the first time in weeks, Ira allowed herself to relax slightly. She was dusting the mantelpiece in one of the larger chambers when she heard voices in the hallway. Deep, male voices, carrying the kind of authority that made her freeze instinctively. Pack leaders from the sound of them, discussing territory disputes and border patrols with the casual confidence of wolves who had never known what it meant to be powerless. Era quickly moved away from the door, positioning herself near the window where she would be less likely to draw attention if anyone entered. But the voices passed by without stopping, fading down the corridor as their owners continued whatever important business occupied the upper levels of pack hierarchy. It was only when the footsteps had completely disappeared that Era allowed herself to breathe again. This was her life now, hiding in plain sight, avoiding notice, doing her work while the important wolves made decisions that would never include her input or consideration. She was returning her attention to the dusting when a new voice spoke from the doorway, so quietly she almost missed it. "You missed a spot." Era spun around, her heart jumping into her throat as she took in the man who stood watching her with unreadable golden eyes. He was tall and powerfully built, with the kind of presence that seemed to fill whatever space he occupied. His dark hair was slightly tousled, as if he'd been running his fingers through it, and his clothes, while clearly expensive, had the practical cut of someone who valued function over fashion. But it was his eyes that held her frozen in place, golden amber flecked with darker honey. They seemed to see straight through her carefully maintained invisibility to something deeper and more dangerous. Alpha King Thane Ironhowl. She knew it without introduction, without announcement, with the same certainty that prey animals knew when a predator had entered their territory. "Your Majesty," Era whispered, dropping into the deep curtsy she'd been taught years ago, her eyes fixed firmly on the floor. "I apologize for what?" His voice cut through her stammered apology with quiet authority. "For doing your job?" Era remained in her curtsy, uncertain whether rising would be seen as presumptuous. "I didn't hear you approach, Your Majesty. I should have been more aware." She heard his footsteps cross the room, slow and measured, until they stopped just close enough that she could see his boots in her peripheral vision. Expensive leather, she noted, polished but worn, the boots of someone who actually used them rather than simply displaying them. "Look at me." The command was spoken softly, but there was no mistaking it for anything other than an order. Era raised her eyes slowly, fighting every instinct that screamed at her to keep her gaze lowered. When her violet eyes met his golden ones, she felt something shift in the air between them, a recognition that went deeper than words, more dangerous than either of them should have allowed. Thane studied her with an intensity that made her skin warm despite the cool air from the windows. His gaze traveled over her face as if he were memorizing details, cataloging features that others had overlooked or dismissed. "What's your name?" he asked finally. "Era, Your Majesty." "Era," she hesitated, knowing that her surname would change everything. But lying to an Alpha King was a death sentence, and he would learn the truth eventually anyway. Era Wolfsbane. Something flickered in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition. But when he spoke again, his voice remained level and controlled. "How long have you been here, Era Wolfsbane?" "Since this morning, Your Majesty. I was sent from the Valley Orphanage to work in the kitchens." Thane nodded slowly, but his eyes never left her face. "And how do you find fortress life so far?" The question seemed genuinely curious rather than threatening, which somehow made it more dangerous. Era searched for the safe answer, the response that would satisfy him without revealing anything that might be used against her later. "It's an honor to serve your Majesty's household," she said carefully. Thane's mouth curved in what might have been amusement. "That's not what I asked." Heat flooded Era's cheeks as she realized her diplomatic non-answer had been recognized for exactly what it was. The fortress is magnificent, Your Majesty. Far grander than anything I've experienced." "Still not an answer," Thane observed, but his tone held no anger. "What I'm hearing is that you've learned to be very careful with your words. That's either wisdom or fear. Which is it, Era Wolfsbane?" The use of her full name sent a chill down her spine, but she forced herself to hold his gaze. "Both, Your Majesty." This time his smile was definitely real, transforming his stern features into something almost approachable. "Honest. That's refreshing in a place where honesty is often considered a luxury few can afford." Before Era could respond, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed from the hallway, accompanied by a voice that carried the particular urgency of bad news. "Your Majesty, Border Patrol reports movement in the Eastern Territories. Lord Commander requests your immediate presence in the war room." Thane's expression immediately shifted back to the controlled authority of a king, receiving reports of potential threats. But his eyes lingered on Era for another moment before he turned toward the door. "Finish your work," he said quietly, the words meant for her alone. "But be careful, Era Wolfsbane. This fortress has a way of noticing things that others prefer to keep hidden." With that cryptic warning, he was gone, leaving Era alone with her racing heart and the unsettling feeling that her carefully planned invisibility had just been thoroughly compromised. She stood frozen for several minutes after his departure, trying to process what had just happened. The Alpha King had spoken to her, not just the brief acknowledgement that servants sometimes received, but an actual conversation. He had used her name, had seemed genuinely interested in her responses. More dangerous still, he had recognized her surname, and hadn't immediately had her thrown in the dungeons or worse. Era forced herself to return to her cleaning, but her hands shook as she finished dusting the mantelpiece. Everything about this interaction felt significant in ways she couldn't understand, charged with implications that extended far beyond a chance encounter between king and servant. As she gathered her supplies and prepared to move to the next room, Era caught a glimpse of herself in the polished surface of a decorative mirror. The girl who stared back looked exactly the same as she had that morning, thin, pale, unremarkable in every way that mattered, but her eyes held a new wariness, a recognition that something fundamental had shifted in her careful, invisible existence. For better or worse, Alpha King Thane Ironhowl had seen her, really seen her, in a way that no one had in 15 years. And that, Era knew with bone-deep certainty, was either the beginning of her salvation or the herald of her destruction. The news of border incursions spread through Ironhowl Fortress like wildfire, carried in hushed whispers by servants and discussed in urgent conferences by the Pack's leadership. Era heard fragments of conversation as she moved through the halls over the following days. Mentions of rogue wolves, territorial disputes with neighboring packs, and the constant undercurrent of tension that came with ruling a territory as vast and valuable as the Ironhowl lands. 3 days had passed since her encounter with Alpha King Thane, and Era had thrown herself into her work with single-minded determination, hoping that diligence might help her fade back into the comfortable anonymity she'd enjoyed before those golden eyes had stripped away her carefully constructed invisibility. She scrubbed floors until her knees ached, polished silver until her reflection gleamed back at her from every surface, and organized linen closets with the meticulous attention to detail that had kept her alive through 5 years of institutional care. But despite her best efforts to become forgettable again, Era couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Not by the other servants, who had settled into treating her with the polite indifference reserved for new arrivals, who might not survive their first month. Not by the guards, who continued to look through her as if she were part of the furniture. The attention she felt was more subtle, more dangerous, the weight of predatory awareness that made her skin prickle with primitive warnings. It was Bertha who finally confirmed her suspicions on the 4th morning, cornering her near the bread ovens while the rest of the kitchen staff was busy with breakfast preparations for the main dining hall. "You've been asking questions about you," the cook said without preamble, her voice pitched low enough that only Era could hear. "Important questions." Era's stomach dropped to somewhere around her knees, but she kept her expression carefully neutral. Years of surviving in places where showing weakness invited predation had taught her to control her reactions, even when fear threatened to overwhelm her completely. "What kind of questions?" she asked quietly, continuing to knead the dough she'd been assigned to prepare for the midday meal. "The kind that gets servants disappeared in the middle of the night," Bertha replied grimly. "Birth records, family history, details about the fall of House Wolfsbane. Someone's been digging into your past, child, and that someone has the authority to access information most people can't even dream of seeing." Era's hand stilled on the dough as the implication sank in. There were very few wolves in the fortress with that level of access to historical records, especially ones dealing with disgraced pack bloodlines. The Alpha King was the most obvious candidate, but the thought that Thane Ironhowl was personally investigating her background sent waves of terror and confusion through her system. Did whoever was asking seem angry? Threatening? Era forced herself to resume kneading the physical activity to keep her rising panic under control. Bertha's expression softened slightly, recognizing the fear that Era was trying so hard to hide. "No, child. Curious, maybe. Thorough, certainly, but not angry. At least not yet." The qualification hung in the air between them like a sword waiting to fall. Not angry, yet implied that anger might come later, depending on what those investigations revealed. And given the circumstances of her family's fall from grace, there was plenty in Era's bloodline that could justify deadly fury from the current rulers of the Northern Territories. "Bertha," Era said carefully, "what exactly happened to House Wolfsbane? I mean, I know the official story, treason, execution, disgrace, but I was only 5 when it happened. The details have always been unclear." The older woman glanced around the kitchen to ensure they weren't being overheard, then moved closer to Era with the conspiratorial air of someone about to share dangerous secrets. "Your father, Lord Aldrich Wolfsbane, was accused of plotting to overthrow the Alpha King's father," Bertha said quietly. "There were letters found, supposedly proving that he'd been in contact with enemy packs, offering to open the northern borders in exchange for support in a coup attempt." Era nodded slowly. This much she had pieced together over the years, from overheard conversations and the cruel taunts of other orphans who had delighted in reminding her of her family's disgrace. "But," Bertha continued, her voice dropping even lower, "there were always those who questioned whether the evidence was genuine. Your father was known for his loyalty to the old king, had served him faithfully for decades. The idea that he would suddenly turn traitor seemed unlikely to those who knew him well." "You think he was framed?" "I think," Bertha said carefully, "that political convenience and absolute truth don't always align. Your father's lands were rich in mineral deposits. His pack's territory controlled several important trade routes. There were other lords who stood to gain significantly from House Wolfsbane's fall." Era felt the world shift slightly around her, as this new information settled into place alongside everything she thought she knew about her family's destruction. If her father had been innocent, if House Wolfsbane had been destroyed for political gain rather than genuine treason, then her entire understanding of her place in the world was built on a foundation of lies. "Why are you telling me this?" Era whispered, her voice barely audible above the sounds of kitchen activity. Bertha's weathered face creased with something that might have been sympathy. "Because I served in this fortress when your parents died, child. I saw the kind of man your father was. Proud, honorable, devoted to his family and his duties. If he was plotting treason, then I'm the queen of the summer courts. And because," she added with a significant look, "I have a feeling that certain powerful wolves might be starting to ask the same questions about what really happened 15 years ago." Before Era could respond, the kitchen doors burst open and Sarah rushed in, her face flushed with excitement and barely controlled panic. "Emergency assembly," she announced breathlessly. "All household staff, main courtyard, immediately. No exceptions, no delays. Lord Commander's orders." Bertha and Ira exchanged quick glances before joining the stream of servants flowing toward the courtyard. Emergency assemblies were rare at Ironhowl Fortress, usually called only in times of genuine crisis, or when examples needed to be made of those who had transgressed against pack law. The main courtyard was already filling with people when they arrived. Not just servants, but guards, minor nobles, craftsmen, and everyone else who called the fortress home. At the center of the space, a raised platform had been erected, draped with the blue and silver banners of House Ironhowl, The formal setup sent chills down Era's spine as she recognized the traditional arrangement used for public pronouncements of the highest importance. "What do you think this is about?" Mary whispered from beside her, wringing her flour-dusted hands nervously. "Border troubles, most likely," Henrik replied grimly. "Been hearing rumors of raids in the Eastern Territories. Might be calling up the militia." But Era had a sinking feeling that this assembly had nothing to do with external threats and everything to do with the investigations that had been conducted into her background. She found herself scanning the crowd unconsciously, looking for escape routes and calculating her chances of disappearing into the forest before anyone noticed her absence. The thought died abruptly when Alpha King Thane Ironhowl stepped onto the platform, his presence immediately commanding the attention of every person in the courtyard. He was dressed in formal court attire rather than his usual practical clothing: deep blue jacket with silver threading, polished boots, and a ceremonial sword at his hip that marked him unmistakably as the ultimate authority in this place. But it was his expression that made Era's blood run cold. Gone was the faint amusement she had seen during their encounter in the guest chamber. This was the face of a king preparing to render judgment, stern and implacable, and utterly without mercy. "Citizens of Ironhowl," Thane's voice carried clearly across the courtyard, without him needing to raise it above conversational volume. The natural authority in his tone demanded silence and received it instantly. "I have called this assembly to address matters that concern the safety and security of our pack." He paused, allowing his gaze to sweep across the assembled crowd, and Era felt her heart stop when those golden eyes found her among the servants. For a moment that felt like an eternity, their gazes locked across the distance, and she saw something flicker in his expression. Recognition, certainly, but also something else that she couldn't interpret. Then he looked away, continuing his address as if that moment of connection had never happened. "It has come to my attention," Thane continued, "that there are those among us who have been less than forthcoming about their identities and backgrounds. In these troubled times, with threats gathering on our borders, such deception cannot be tolerated." Era's knees nearly buckled as the implications hit her. This was about her. This entire assembly, this formal gathering of the pack's full population, was being held because the Alpha King had discovered something about her past that he deemed worthy of public revelation. "Deception in any form weakens the bonds that hold a pack together," Thane said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute judgment. "It undermines trust, breeds suspicion, and creates vulnerabilities that our enemies can exploit. Therefore, it is my duty to ensure that all who dwell within these walls are exactly who they claim to be." Murmurs began to ripple through the crowd as people started glancing around, trying to identify who might be the target of the Alpha King's displeasure. Several gazes fell on Era, drawn perhaps by her obvious nervousness, or by instincts that recognized her as different from the other servants. "Lord Commander," Thane called, and a massive man in formal military dress stepped forward from the side of the platform. "Present your findings." The Lord Commander unrolled a scroll with ceremonial precision, clearing his throat before beginning to read in a voice that carried clearly across the courtyard. "By order of Alpha King Thane Ironhowl, sovereign ruler of the Northern Territories, an investigation was conducted into the background and identity of one Era Wolfsbane, recently arrived at this fortress as a servant assigned to household duties." Era heard her name echo across the courtyard and felt every eye in the crowd turn toward her. The servants around her instinctively stepped back, creating a circle of empty space that marked her as clearly as if she had been standing on the platform itself. She could hear whispers starting, her notorious surname being repeated and passed through the crowd like wildfire. "The investigation revealed the following facts," the Lord Commander continued relentlessly. "Ira Wolfsbane is the sole surviving child of Lord Aldrich Wolfsbane and Lady Morwen Wolfsbane, executed 15 years ago for high treason against the crown. She is the last known heir to the bloodline of House Wolfsbane, stripped of title and lands following her parents' conviction." The whispers grew louder, some shocked, some angry, some fearful. Era stood frozen in her circle of isolation, feeling like a deer caught in an open field with wolves closing in from all directions. "Furthermore," the Lord Commander's voice rose above the crowd noise, "the investigation uncovered evidence suggesting that the original charges against Lord Aldrich Wolfsbane may have been based on fabricated evidence, planted by enemies seeking to claim Wolfsbane lands and resources for themselves." The courtyard erupted into chaos. Voices rose in shock, confusion, and outrage as the implications of this revelation sank in. If House Wolfsbane had been destroyed based on false charges, then 15 years of political arrangements, land distributions, and power structures had been built on a foundation of lies and murder. Era felt the world spinning around her as she tried to process what she was hearing. Her father had been innocent. Her family had been destroyed not because of treason, but because of greed and political maneuvering. Everything she had been taught to believe about her place in the world, about the shame she carried in her very name, had been a carefully constructed deception. "Silence!" Thane's voice cut through the chaos like a blade, immediately restoring order to the assembly. "The investigation into these matters is ongoing. Until it is complete, no judgments will be rendered, and no actions will be taken against any party." However, his gaze found Era again across the crowd. "Justice delayed is justice denied. It is time for truth to be restored to light." He stepped forward to the edge of the platform, his presence commanding absolute attention from every person in the courtyard. "Era Wolfsbane," he called formally, his voice carrying the weight of royal command. "Step forward." Era's legs felt like water as she forced herself to move through the crowd toward the platform. The people around her parted silently, their faces ranging from curious to hostile to pitying. She could feel the weight of hundreds of gazes following her progress, marking every step, cataloging every detail of her appearance for future gossip and speculation. When she reached the base of the platform, Era dropped into the deepest curtsy she could manage, her eyes fixed firmly on the ground as protocol demanded. Her heart was beating so hard she was certain everyone in the courtyard could hear it, and her hands shook where they gripped the fabric of her servant's dress. "Rise," Thane commanded, and Era forced herself to stand, though she kept her gaze lowered out of habit and terror. "Look at me, Era," the same words he had spoken to her in the guest chamber, but now they carried the formal weight of royal command rather than personal curiosity. Era raised her eyes slowly, fighting every instinct that screamed at her to keep them lowered, and found herself once again caught by those penetrating golden eyes. "Do you understand what has been revealed here today?" Thane asked, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent courtyard. "Yes, Your Majesty," Era whispered, her voice barely audible despite the perfect acoustics of the space. "Do you have anything to say in response to these revelations?" Era's mind raced as she tried to find words adequate to the moment. She was standing before the most powerful wolf in the Northern Territories, in front of the entire population of his fortress, having just learned that everything she had believed about her family's disgrace was a lie. What could she possibly say that would be appropriate, safe, or meaningful? She started, then stopped as her voice cracked with emotion. She took a shaky breath and tried again. "I am grateful for the truth, Your Majesty, whatever it may cost." Something flickered in Thane's expression at her words. Approval, perhaps, or a recognition of the courage it took to speak of costly truth when standing so vulnerably before a crowd that could turn hostile at any moment. "The truth has many costs," he replied quietly, though his words carried clearly in the absolute silence of the courtyard. "But lies cost more. They cost lives, families, futures that should never have been destroyed." He stepped closer to the edge of the platform, close enough that Era could see the conflict in his golden eyes, the weight of decisions that went far beyond a single girl's fate. "Era Wolfsbane," he said formally, "you were brought to this fortress as a servant, stripped of name and birthright by laws that may have been based on injustice. Until the full truth of your family's fate can be determined, you will remain under the protection of this pack and this crown. No harm will come to you while you dwell within these walls. This I swear by the ancient laws that bind us all." The formal protection was more than Era had ever dared hope for, but she could hear the careful wording that stopped just short of full restoration. She would be protected, but she would remain a servant until the investigation proved her father's innocence conclusively. It was justice tempered with political reality, a recognition that complete vindication would require time and evidence that might take months or years to gather. "Thank you, Your Majesty," she managed, dropping into another curtsy to hide the tears that threatened to spill down her cheeks. "Lord Commander," Thane called without taking his eyes off Era, "see that Miss Wolfsbane is assigned quarters appropriate to her protection status. She is no longer to be housed with the general servant population." Era's head snapped up in surprise. Protection status meant quarters in the secure areas of the fortress, places reserved for minor nobles and important guests. It was a dramatic elevation in her circumstances, one that would create as many problems as it solved. "Your Majesty," she said quickly. "I don't need special quarters. I'm content to remain where I am." Thane's smile was slight, but unmistakable. "I'm sure you are. But your contentment is not the primary concern here. Your safety is. And people with claims to destroyed bloodlines, even questionable ones, have a tendency to meet unfortunate accidents when left unprotected." The warning was clear, delivered in a tone that suggested he had seen such convenient accidents before. Ira nodded her understanding, recognizing that arguing further would be both futile and potentially dangerous. "The assembly is concluded," Thane announced to the crowd, his voice returning to its formal authority. "Return to your duties. Speak of what you have heard here with wisdom and caution. Truth is a powerful force, but like all powerful forces, it can be destructive when wielded carelessly." The crowd began to disperse slowly, reluctant to leave such compelling drama behind. Ira found herself surrounded by whispered conversations as people discussed the implications of what they had witnessed, their voices carrying fragments of speculation, gossip, and political analysis. Always thought there was something different about her. If House Wolfsbane was innocent, then who really? Dangerous precedent, overturning executions after 15 years. "King's taken an unusual interest in the girl, hasn't he?" That last comment sent fresh chills down Era's spine as she realized how her protection might be interpreted by the court. Royal interest in a servant girl, especially one with a complicated background, would fuel rumors that could be dangerous for both of them. As if reading her thoughts, Thane descended from the platform and approached her with measured steps, his expression carefully neutral in a way that probably fooled no one who was paying attention. "Walk with me," he said quietly, the words pitched for her ears alone. "There are things we need to discuss privately." Ira nodded and fell into step beside him as he led her away from the dispersing crowd, toward a section of the fortress she had never seen before. They walked in silence through corridors lined with portraits of former Alpha Kings and battle scenes that told the history of the Ironhowl Pack's rise to power. Finally, Thane stopped before a heavy oak door marked with his personal seal. He produced a key from somewhere within his jacket and unlocked the door, gesturing for her to precede him into what was clearly his private study. The room was spacious, but not ostentatious, lined with bookshelves and dominated by a massive desk that spoke of someone who spent significant time reading and writing rather than simply giving orders. Maps covered one wall, marked with pins and notations that tracked pack territories, trade routes, and potential threats. It was the workspace of a ruler who took his responsibilities seriously, who understood that leadership required knowledge as much as authority. "Please sit," Thane said, indicating a chair positioned across from his desk. "You look like you're about to collapse." Ira settled into the offered chair gratefully, only now realizing how much the events of the past hour had drained her. Her legs felt weak, her hands were still shaking, and her mind was reeling with the magnitude of everything that had changed in the space of a single assembly. Thane moved to a cabinet against one wall and retrieved a crystal decanter filled with amber liquid. He poured 2 glasses, offering one to Ira, before settling into the chair behind his desk. "Drink," he said when she hesitated. "It's just whiskey. You need something to steady your nerves." Ira accepted the glass and took a small sip, wincing as the alcohol burned her throat. She wasn't accustomed to spirits, but the warmth that spread through her chest was admittedly comforting. "You handled that well?" Thane observed, taking a drink from his own glass. Most people would have fallen apart under that kind of public scrutiny. "I've had practice being stared at," Ira replied quietly, though usually not by quite so many people at once. Thane's expression sobered. "I'm sorry you had to endure that. But there was no way to address the situation privately, without raising suspicions about why I was taking such personal interest in a servant's background." "Is that what you're doing? Taking personal interest?" The question slipped out before Ira could stop herself, fueled by exhaustion and the whiskey's loosening effect on her usual caution. She immediately regretted it when she saw Thane's expression shift to something more guarded. "I'm interested in justice," he said carefully. "If your family was wrongfully destroyed, then those responsible need to be held accountable. And you—" He paused, studying her over the rim of his glass. "You deserve to know the truth about who you really are." "I know who I am," Ira said firmly. "I'm a servant in your household, nothing more or less than that. Whatever my bloodline might have been, it doesn't change my current circumstances. Doesn't it?" Thane leaned forward slightly, his golden eyes intent. "You carry yourself like nobility, Ira. You speak like someone educated beyond the usual servant's training. You have instincts and mannerisms that can't be trained out, no matter how many years you spent in an orphanage. Era set down her glass with more force than necessary. None of that matters. Bloodline doesn't make someone worthy of respect or consideration. Actions do. Choices do. And I choose to earn my place through work and service, not by claiming privileges I don't deserve. Even if those privileges were stolen from you unjustly. The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that made Era's chest tight with emotions she couldn't afford to examine too closely. She wanted to believe that justice could be retroactive, that wrongs could be righted even after 15 years. But she had learned too well that hope was a luxury that could destroy you if you let it take root. Justice delayed is justice denied, she said, echoing his earlier words. My parents are dead. My family's lands have been redistributed, and I've lived half my life as someone else. Even if you could prove their innocence tomorrow, it wouldn't bring them back or undo the damage that's been done. Thane was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful as he considered her words. You're right, he said finally. Some things can't be undone, but others can be addressed. Your father's reputation could be cleared. Your family name could be restored. You could reclaim what was always rightfully yours, and destabilize half your territory in the process, Era pointed out. How many current landholders would fight to keep what they gained from House Wolfsbane's fall? How many political alliances would crumble if you started overturning executions from 15 years ago? Thane's smile was sharp and entirely predatory. Let me worry about the political consequences. I've been managing rebellious nobles and territorial disputes since I took the throne 10 years ago. A few disgruntled landholders aren't going to threaten the stability of my kingdom. There was steel beneath his casual tone, a reminder that this was a man who had consolidated power through a combination of strategic brilliance and ruthless efficiency. The nobles who might object to House Wolfsbane's restoration would think twice before challenging an alpha king who had never lost a territorial dispute or political confrontation. Why? Era asked quietly. Why does this matter to you? You could have simply had me relocated to another territory, removed the potential problem without getting involved in historical investigations. Why take on the complications? Thane set down his glass and leaned back in his chair, studying her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken, despite her best efforts to remain unaffected. Because, he said slowly, I've spent 10 years ruling through strength and political necessity. I've made the hard choices, crushed the rebellions, eliminated the threats. And somewhere in all of that, I lost sight of what a king is supposed to stand for beyond simple survival. He stood and moved to the window, gazing out at the territories that stretched beyond the fortress walls. Justice, Era. Honor. Protection of the innocent. These are supposed to be the foundations of legitimate rule. And if I can't provide justice for one girl whose family was wrongfully destroyed, then what kind of king am I? What kind of legacy am I building? Era felt something shift in her chest, a dangerous warmth that had nothing to do with the whiskey, and everything to do with the man who stood silhouetted against the afternoon light. She was seeing past the Alpha King's authority to something more personal, more vulnerable, the doubts and responsibilities that came with absolute power. You're a good king, she said quietly. Your people are fed, protected, prosperous. Your territory is secure and your enemies fear you. That's more than most rulers achieve. Thane turned from the window, his expression unreadable. Is it enough, though? Is it enough to be feared and obeyed if you're not also respected and trusted? The question was clearly rhetorical, but Era found herself answering anyway. Respect and trust are earned through actions over time. Fear is just a tool. It's how you use it that determines what kind of leader you are. And how am I using it? Era met his gaze directly, recognizing that this conversation had moved far beyond the bounds of what should exist between a king and a servant. But the whiskey and the emotional upheaval of the day had stripped away her usual caution, leaving her with nothing but honesty. You're using it to protect someone who couldn't protect herself, she said. You're using it to seek justice for people who can no longer seek it themselves. That doesn't sound like tyranny to me. Thane moved closer to her chair, close enough that she could see the flecks of darker gold in his amber eyes, could feel the warmth radiating from his body despite the cool air in the study. And what does it sound like? He asked quietly. Era's breath caught as she realized how dangerous this moment had become, how completely they had crossed the line between appropriate political discussion and something far more personal, but she couldn't seem to stop herself from answering. "It sounds like hope," she whispered. For a heartbeat that felt like an eternity, they simply looked at each other across the small space that separated them. Era could see her own confusion and growing awareness reflected in Thane's eyes, could feel the pull of something that went far beyond gratitude or political alliance. Then Thane stepped back abruptly, the spell broken by what was probably wisdom disguised as cowardice. "I should let you get settled into your new quarters," he said, his voice carefully neutral despite the intensity that had marked the previous moment. "Lord Commander will show you the way and explain the security protocols." Era nodded and rose from her chair, recognizing the dismissal for what it was, a necessary retreat from territory that neither of them was prepared to explore. "At least not yet. Thank you, Your Majesty," she said formally, dropping into a curtsy that felt strange after the intimacy of their conversation. "For everything." Thane's smile was slight, but genuine. "Thank me when we've actually found the truth, Era. Until then, be careful. You're under my protection now, but that protection comes with its own dangers. There are those who won't appreciate the implications of your potential restoration." Era nodded her understanding and moved toward the door, pausing when Thane spoke her name one more time. "Era?" She turned back, meeting his golden gaze across the study. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I think your parents would be proud of the woman you've become. Bloodline or no bloodline, title or no title, you have the kind of strength that can't be inherited or bestowed. It has to be earned." The words followed her as she left his study, and allowed the Lord Commander to escort her through corridors she had never seen before, to quarters that represented a complete transformation of her circumstances. But more than the change in her living situation, more than the revelation about her family's potential innocence, it was Thane's final comment that lingered in her mind. For the first time in 15 years, someone saw strength in her rather than simply tolerating weakness, and that recognition was more dangerous than any political complication or restored bloodline could ever be. The quarters assigned to Era under her protection status were a world apart from the servants' dormitory where she had spent her first week at the fortress. Located in the secure wing reserved for minor nobles and important guests, her new room featured a proper bed with clean linens, a writing desk positioned near a window that offered views of the mountain peaks, and most luxuriously, her own small fireplace that kept the space warm against the encroaching winter cold. But comfort came with a price. The elevated quarters meant increased scrutiny from nobles who viewed her presence as an intrusion into their privileged space, servants who now regarded her with suspicion and envy, and guards whose watchful eyes reminded her constantly that protection and imprisonment could sometimes look remarkably similar. 3 weeks had passed since the public assembly, and the investigation into House Wolfsbane's fall had unearthed evidence that painted an increasingly damning picture of political conspiracy. Letters had been found in archived documents that suggested coordination between rival houses, financial records showing suspicious payments made just before her father's arrest, and testimony from aging servants who had remained silent for 15 years out of fear. Era learned these developments in fragments, overheard conversations, careful briefings from Lord Commander, and occasional private discussions with Thane that walked the line between official business and something more personal. Each revelation brought her closer to vindication, while simultaneously making her more dangerous to those who had profited from her family's destruction. The tension reached its breaking point on a gray morning when Era was returning from her daily walk in the fortress gardens. She had maintained the routine despite her changed circumstances, finding peace in the quiet paths where winter flowers still bloomed despite the cold. It was a small rebellion against the restrictions of her protection status, though she never wandered beyond sight of the guards who shadowed her movements. She was approaching the main entrance when voices from an alcove caught her attention, not because they were particularly loud, but because her name was spoken with unmistakable venom. Growing tired of this charade, the girl should have been dealt with quietly from the beginning. His Majesty seems quite invested in her welfare, perhaps more than royal interest in justice would warrant. Exactly my point. She's becoming a liability in more ways than one. If the king's judgment is compromised by personal attachment. Era pressed herself against the wall, recognizing the voices as belonging to Lord Garrett Blackstone and Lady Vivian Ashford, two of the most influential nobles in Thane's court. Both had been among the houses that had gained territory after House Wolfsbane's fall, and both had been increasingly hostile as the investigation progressed. "The investigation must be stopped," Blackstone continued. "If it continues, It won't just be Wolfsbane lands that come under scrutiny. Our own acquisitions from that period could be questioned. Agreed. But how do we convince His Majesty to abandon his pursuit without appearing to oppose royal justice? We don't convince him. Lady Ashford's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. We remove the source of his distraction. If the girl were to meet with an unfortunate accident, too obvious now. She's under royal protection, with guards and secure quarters. Any harm that came to her would be immediately suspicious. Then we make it appear to come from elsewhere. There are rogue wolves in the Eastern Territories, displaced by the recent border conflicts. If one such wolf were to breach the fortress defenses, target the girl specifically, tragic, but hardly the fault of loyal nobles. Era's blood turned to ice as the implications sank in. They were planning her murder, discussing it with the casual tone of people arranging a business transaction. Worse, they intended to make it appear as though external enemies were responsible, which would absolve them while potentially destabilizing Thane's rule. She needed to move, to get away before they finished their conversation and discovered her eavesdropping. But as she tried to step back quietly, her foot knocked against a loose stone that skittered across the ground with a sound that seemed thunderous in the tense silence. The conversation stopped immediately. Someone's there. Blackstone's voice carried clearly from the alcove. Ira ran. There was no point in trying to hide or pretend she hadn't been listening. The guilty awareness in her racing heart would be obvious to any wolf with functioning senses. Her only chance was to reach the main fortress before they could catch her, to find sanctuary in populated areas where witnesses would make violence more difficult. She heard heavy footsteps pursuing her as she sprinted across the courtyard, but her head start and lighter weight gave her an advantage in the short distance to the entrance. Era burst through the main doors and nearly collided with Thane, who was emerging from a meeting with his advisors. Era? He caught her arms to steady her, his golden eyes immediately alert as he took in her flushed face and panicked expression. What's wrong? They're going to kill me, she gasped, still breathless from her sprint. Blackstone and Ashford. They're planning to have me murdered and blame it on rogue wolves. Thane's expression went deadly still, his hands tightening on her arms as the implications registered. Behind her, Era could hear Blackstone and Ashford approaching the entrance, their voices carrying forced casualness that didn't quite hide their urgency. How much did you hear? Thane asked quietly. Thane, enough to know they think your judgment is compromised because of me, and enough to know they're planning to solve that problem permanently. Thane's eyes flashed with something that made Era's pulse quicken. Not fear this time, but something far more dangerous and infinitely more protective. Stay close to me, he murmured, then turned to face the approaching nobles with a smile that would have frozen blood in warmer men. Lord Blackstone, Lady Ashford. Thane's voice carried its usual authority, but Era could hear the steel beneath the courtesy. How fortuitous. I was just discussing security concerns with my advisors. Perhaps you could join us? Blackstone's face had gone pale when he realized Thane and Era were together, but he managed a credible attempt at normal composure. Of course, Your Majesty. Though I should mention, we were just discussing similar concerns ourselves. Were you indeed? Thane's smile widened, becoming even more terrifying. How interesting. Please, elaborate on these concerns. The next few minutes were a masterclass in political maneuvering as Thane guided the conversation with surgical precision, leading Blackstone and Ashford into increasingly uncomfortable territory, while never quite allowing them to realize how thoroughly they had been exposed. By the end of it, both nobles had painted themselves into a corner where their opposition to the investigation looked suspiciously like guilt. Their concerns about Era's safety sounded more like threats than warnings, and their suggestions about external enemies became obvious attempts at misdirection. Thank you both for your insights, Thane concluded finally. I find myself wondering how you came to be so well informed about rogue wolf activities in the Eastern Territories. Perhaps you could compile a detailed report on your sources for my review. The dismissal was polite but absolute, and both nobles retreated with the careful dignity of people who knew they had lost a battle, but weren't yet ready to concede the war. When they were alone again, Thane turned to Era with an expression that mixed concern, anger, and something else that made her breath catch. You realize what this means? He asked quietly. Era nodded. The investigation is getting close to something they can't afford to have exposed, and they see me as the weak link that can be eliminated to protect their interests. More than that. Thane stepped closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. They think I'm compromised. They believe my feelings for you are affecting my judgment as king." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that neither had dared voice before. Era felt her heart stop, then restart with a rhythm that seemed too loud in the sudden silence. "Are they right?" she whispered. Thane's answer came not in words, but in action. His hands cupped her face with infinite gentleness, his thumbs brushing across her cheekbones as he looked into her eyes, with an intensity that made the world shrink to just the space between them. "They're absolutely right," he said quietly, "and that terrifies me more than any political conspiracy or external threat ever could." When his lips met hers, it was with a reverence that spoke of feelings held in check for too long, of barriers finally crumbling under the weight of truth that could no longer be denied. Era melted into the kiss, her hands finding the fabric of his shirt as she anchored herself to the reality of this impossible moment. They broke apart slowly, reluctantly, both breathing hard as the magnitude of what had just happened settled around them. "This changes everything," Era whispered. "Yes," Thane agreed, his forehead resting against hers. "It changes everything, and I find I don't care about the consequences nearly as much as I should." Before Era could respond, the sound of running footsteps echoed from the corridor, followed by Lord Commander's urgent voice. "Your Majesty, critical development in the investigation. We've found the original correspondence, the real letters that prove Lord Wolfsbane's innocence." Thane and Era separated quickly, though his hand found hers, and squeezed gently before he turned to address his approaching officer. "Show me," Thane commanded. Lord Commander produced a leather portfolio, spreading documents across a nearby table with ceremonial care. These were hidden in a secret compartment in Lord Blackstone's family vault. "Our search warrant turned up evidence of the conspiracy, including the forged letters used to frame Lord Wolfsbane and records of payments made to witnesses who gave false testimony." Era stared at the documents that represented 15 years of truth finally brought to light. Her father's innocence was no longer a matter of speculation or political convenience. It was documented fact, supported by evidence that would be impossible to dispute or discredit. "There's more," Lord Commander continued. "We also found recent correspondence discussing plans to eliminate remaining members of House Wolfsbane. The threat to Miss Era wasn't theoretical, it was already in motion." Thane's expression went deadly calm as he processed this information. "Arrest warrants, being prepared as we speak, Your Majesty. Lord Blackstone, Lady Ashford, and 3 other conspirators identified in the documents. Charges of high treason, conspiracy to commit murder, and falsification of royal documents." Ira felt the world shift around her as 15 years of lies finally crumbled completely. Her family was vindicated, their murderers identified, and her own life secured by evidence that made her value as a witness absolute. But more than vindication, more than justice, what mattered most was the man who stood beside her, whose hand still held hers despite the presence of his officers, whose eyes held promises of a future that neither of them had dared imagine just hours before. "Your Majesty," Lord Commander said carefully, "there's also the matter of House Wolfsbane's restoration. With Lord Wolfsbane's innocence proven, his daughter would be entitled to full restoration of title, lands, and political position." Thane turned to Era, his golden eyes searching her face. "Lady Era Wolfsbane," he said formally, though his voice carried warmth that was anything but official. "How do you wish to proceed?" Dara looked at the documents that could restore everything her family had lost, at the man whose love had given her something worth more than any title, and at the future that stretched before them like uncharted territory, full of infinite possibility. "I want justice for my parents," she said firmly. "But I also want to build something new, something that honors their memory while creating hope for tomorrow." She turned to face Thane fully, her heart in her eyes. "I want to stand beside a king who values justice over convenience, who protects the innocent even when it's politically inconvenient, who rules with both strength and mercy." Thane's smile was radiant as he lifted their joined hands to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that felt like a vow. "Then, that's exactly what you'll have," he promised. "Starting with a royal wedding that will show the world that love recognizes no barriers of birth or circumstance." As word spread through the fortress that Lady Era Wolfsbane would become queen, that justice had finally triumphed over conspiracy, and that their Alpha King had chosen love over political expedience, Era realized that sometimes the most profound transformations begin with a single act of courage, whether crossing a raging river to save cubs, or or trusting your heart to a king who sees your worth, even when the world has forgotten it. The poor girl who had arrived as nothing more than a servant had indeed captured the Alpha King's heart. But more than that, she had helped him remember that true strength lay not in inspiring fear, but in choosing love despite the risks. And that was a lesson that would reshape not just their lives, but the very nature of the kingdom they would rule together. If you enjoyed this story, a like or comment really helps. And if you wish to hear more tales like this one, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next tale.